So, good afternoon. That is, from what I understand, the earliest opera ever written by Monteverdi, which just means Green Mountain, right? Orfeo is, what do we call him? Orpheus, I guess, which is odd because that's Latin. But this is the opera about Orfeo who falls in love with Eurydice, however you want to say her name. They get married, so there's a beautiful wedding ceremony. Everybody's all happy, and then famously she is bit by a snake and dies, and he's so upset, of course, as you can imagine, and goes to Hades, or hell, to try to bring her back, which is kind of an interesting, I don't know if you've ever tried that, but in any case, he goes and succeeds in persuading hell to let her go, with one condition, and that is that he doesn't look at her until she's completely left the cave, which is the entrance. And so as they're coming out of the cave, he in front, he hears her stumble and fall behind him. And of course, you know how that always happens. The one rule you're not allowed to do is look at her before she's all, and he does. And of course, that draws her back, and she fades back into hell. And so then he leaves and goes about the world singing his grief. And he's supposed to have been the most wonderful singer ever. And so Orpheus cults, or Orpheus is usually the name of a lot of the various choruses that of course are in his name, etc. And there is Orpheus cults associated with that, and that's associated with bringing the dead back to life. So that's kind of interesting. The way the Catholic Mass is considered to be an Orphic cult in that sense, where obviously you're not really trying to bring a dead person back, but the idea of Jesus being sacrificed and then being resurrected in the ceremony and then passed around for everyone to partake is considered to be an Orphic ritual. So that's kind of interesting, I suppose. But just wanted to point this out, because if you look at the dates, I don't know if either Pascal or Spinoza would have had a chance to listen to this music. This was in Italy. The theaters I'm familiar with from this time, this actual production, by the way, was in Spain, in Barcelona, but the original Monteverdi was Italian. Notice it was sung in Italian, which is kind of interesting, instead of Latin. And by the way, they were also attempting to copy what they thought the Greek theater was like. Their interpretation at the time of the Greek plays was that those Greek plays were sung, not just, and they may have been, at least parts of them. The choruses may have been sung and so on in Greek plays. By the way, I noticed that Lysistrata is being performed on campus this semester, if you're interested. Highly recommended. I may go if I get the chance. That's one of the really hilarious ones. A little risque. The basic plot is that the women of the one town get together with the women of the other town that are both fighting one another. The men are fighting one another. And the women agree to go on a sex strike until the men quit fighting. So it's just one of those hilarious Greek plays. Okay, that's just fun. So Pascal, the first one we're looking at today. lots of famous things about him. I suppose the most famous quote from him is that what's true on one side of the Pyrenees is false on the other. It's kind of a critique of human so-called knowledge, that we obviously don't know everything. I don't think it meant that he thought that knowledge is actually relative, but rather that it was a critique of what men thought they knew. And you could check that and see, what different people believe, etc. Other things he's famous for, being a mathematician, of course, and he gave us lots of interesting things. I suppose the most famous of those is Pascal's triangle. Which, notice it's 1 at the top, 2 ones, then 1, 2, 1. All you're doing is where the 2 numbers above come together, you add those 2, and you end up with 2 if you have 1 and 1, or 3 if you have 1 and 2, etc. You see the pattern? It's very easy to set up. But the neat thing about it is that you could use that. There's Harry Potter here. Sounds like the noise from one of the things he does. Is that coming from me?
I think so.
Stop it. Okay, so yes, you could use this to basically give you a hint to equations, because they match for some reason. They match when you do. I guess we should look at the fabulous Wikipedia. Well, that all explains that. I wonder if this is on too. Okay. So you can figure out equations with the patterns from the triangle. This way. That's it. He also invented a calculating machine, which is considered by some to be the first computer, which is dumb because obviously the Chinese have an ancient computer called an abacus. So if you're thinking in terms of just a purely mechanical device that you can manipulate to help you add and subtract, it's not the first, but if you're European, I suppose, it's kind of thrilling to have this as your first one. And obviously there are some still in existence. The next one that we think of that's more powerful is the one that Gottfried Leibniz invents, which eventually becomes, as I understand it, a little device that an international business machine company uses to become an important company, IBM. I guess you've heard of them. So that's interesting. The other interesting, more famous thing, I suppose, is his wager. It's an argument for the existence of God. Let's see if I can make that bigger. So this is not an attempt to persuade you to believe that God exists. It's rather an attempt to persuade you that believing in God is a rational choice. Must have something to do with wave technology. So he's not trying to convince you that God exists with this, but he's trying to convince you that you're not being a dummy, because when you get right down to the basics, you have two choices of believing in that God exists or not, And then there's two possibilities. You're either right or you're not. And so if you break that down, that gives you a 50-50 chance either way. So compare, for example, if you were betting on a horse and you had a 50-50 chance that your bet would win, and it only cost you $1 to bet on a horse, and if the horse won 50-50, the horse would pay $1 million. It's actually bigger, according to this, but it would be silly. It would be silly in that case not to bet 50-50 chance to win $1 million with the cost of $1. That would be pretty dumb not to vote on the horse. It's of course different when you look at the lotteries and things where you pay $1 for a ticket. You could buy 5 tickets, whatever, and you look at the bottom and it tells you you've got a 1 in 7 billion chance to win 50 cents or something. That's pretty dumb. That's why it's called a poor man's tax, because a lot of communities create these lotteries to basically bilk money from those who are silly enough to buy the tickets, and then they usually use that fund, the profit from those, in order to pay for the things that they don't really want to spend money on in the community. So basically it's getting the poor people to pay for the poor people's things, which is kind of mean and rotten, taking advantage of the gullible. But in this case, he's not suggesting that you're gullible. He's suggesting that you be silly not to take the argument. Of course, there's way more opportunities. I think this is... I guess you've seen this. That's kind of funny. The idea here is that it's not really even just one God. There's millions of possible gods out there. So that kind of dilutes the wager a little bit. Plus, if the reward for believing in God is eternal happiness in heaven, that's a whole nother bet, really, if that's even possible, etc. Might not be the case. Could be the way Epicurus argues: the gods exist, but it's wrong to think that they care about us. Their main interest is with one another, or playing dice with the universe or something. Whereas they would step on us. The main thing we need to know is how to avoid being stepped on by the gods. That's kind of another approach to that. So Blaise Pascal. What else seems to me there are lots of things. Now, Pascal died very early by comparison with what we hope to live today. I think he was 39. That look about right. Yeah, 39. I always forget to check that Wikipedia actually gives you the answer, right? But he did have a religious experience towards the end of his life, and was absolutely convinced that God existed, and at that point became a Catholic theologian. So that's interesting, I suppose. Any questions on Pascal? I don't know that I really have very many answers on Blaise Pascal. But Spinoza, I think of it as much more important. He's going to have, at least in my readings, he has much more of an impact on followers. Spinozaism is a actual word, whereas I've never heard of Pascalism, so that's kind of interesting. Baruch di Spinoza, just the name is kind of interesting because he was Jewish, born in Amsterdam. His family had moved there from Spain because after Spain was, now I get these mixed up. There's two occasions where the Jews fled Spain. The one time was after El Cid conquered Spain, retook Spain back and chased the Moors out of Spain. And that was a bad time for Jews because the Moors had been more open to different religious groups than the Christians. When the Christians took it back, you had the choice of being converted or burned at the stake or killed in some way. Not a very nice choice. And in fact, a lot of the people that converted actually were never quite really allowed to participate fully in society, because they were never quite trusted as a result of them having been Jewish, probably for good reason. In any case, the other would be the result of the Inquisition, and that's when the Jesuits would check people to make sure that they weren't Jewish, and that was another occasion where many people fled Spain because the Jesuits were much more vicious there. They were actually pretty vicious all over southern Europe, but if you managed to get to the Netherlands, you were much safer. So the Netherlands was a much safer place for everyone, I suppose. The main reason for that is basically that France was Catholic, but northern Germany was Protestant, and the Netherlands, being nestled in between the two, felt it politically best to not be especially one or the other. And they kind of were open to people from either side. Now that didn't mean that as a Jewish family that you were okay, because the Jewish people were still not considered as saved as either the Protestants or the Catholics, but I guess it was overall a better deal. It still could be bad for you, depending on how quiet you were. As long as you were a good Jewish person, so that even the Jewish community liked you, that was better than if you were a rebel even in the Jewish community. And Spinoza was a rebel even in the Jewish community. The interesting aspect of it was he was the best student in his class in the rabbi's synagogue class, and in fact the rabbi believed that Spinoza would be his replacement. When he got too old to teach the young people in the synagogue, that Spinoza would be the next, because he was so brilliant a student. What the rabbi didn't realize was that even though he was a brilliant student and understood everything, he also had doubts about everything. And when he started voicing those as he got older, the community got very upset with him and warned him that he had to stop it, but he didn't. And so they kicked him out. It's kind of a little video here. See if I can find it right off. Maybe not. it's gone. Ah, there it is.
Joshua, or rather, the author who wrote his history, he thought that the sun revolves around the earth is fixed.
All the earth, rains, mountains. You hear me? Yes. The puppets are ready to begin. History is knocking on the door. In the year 1517, Martin Luther challenged Rome.
The Church of Rome is corrupt. Here begins the Reformation.
The English king, Henry, a man of many parts, breaks with Rome. The papists have made this earth a living hell. In the year 1600, Giordano Bruno questions the religion of Rome. He preaches dissent, and for this he is burnt. But my friends, beware. It is not only the papists we must guard against. On the 24th of November, 1632, in the Jewish quarter of this our fair town of Amsterdam, Baruch de Espinosa was born. As he grew, he began to question everything. Everything, creation and our Creator.
So that's a cool video. I highly recommend it if you get the chance. With regard to his name, though, in Hebrew his name is Barak. By the way, the same as our last president, Barack Hussein Obama, which is kind of interesting. Baruch is the Latinized version, or wait a minute. Now I'm confused. I used to know all this. I think Baruch is the Hebrew version and Barak is the Arabic version. But I screwed that up. Sorry about that. In both cases, it means blessed. So that's kind of, I remember I switched my party from Republican to Democrat so that I could vote for Obama in the primary instead of Hillary. Kind of interesting. But I thought, wow, that would be absolutely great. And one of the things I thought was, wouldn't it be cool, as far as the terrorists were concerned, if we had a president that was, his name was blessed in Arabic? That would just, like, boy, how would the terrorists still attack us if that were the case, right? Sorry, that's just kind of a strange aspect, I guess, of me. In any case, in Latin, the word Baruch or Barak is Benedict. So, of course, you can find Baruch Spinoza, Benedict Spinoza, Benedito, obviously, Portuguese, it says, and his family had actually come from Portugal, not Spain. I'm sorry. I get those mixed up too. In any case, blessed is the English translation. So if you're reading his ethics and you were absolutely going crazy and you thought to yourself, blessed Spinoza, then that's exactly right. So there's kind of a joke in there if you get to it. So that's interesting. So he's kicked out of the synagogue because of his beliefs, and some of those beliefs, I can go to my own notes for some of this. I suddenly just got very hungry. I don't know how that happened. It's pretty weird. In any case, Spinoza, he studied the scriptures. That's obviously something that they would be doing in the synagogue, the Talmud and Jewish medieval classics in Hebrew. But then he went and studied Latin with an ex-Jesuit who started a school, by the way, and he ended up being one of the teachers at that school for that ex-Jesuit. But by studying with the ex-Jesuit, he became acquainted with Descartes, Bacon, Hobbes, and the mechanistic science of nature, that whole movement. And as a result, he was expelled and cursed from the synagogue because of his beliefs. Heterodox, by the way, the word means orthodoxa is the correct beliefs, and heterodox means against the correct, right? So wrong, basically. If you're heterodox, you're wrong, basically. But, by the way, he did not renounce his Jewish heritage. So that's kind of interesting, because when he was kicked out of the synagogue, that meant not only that he was not allowed back in anymore, but he was not allowed to even be greeted by his fellows on the street. If they saw him coming, they had to go to the other side of the street. So they really were trying to change him by ostracizing him completely from their community. I'm not sure how that changed the rest of the communities, because it's a mixed community. But I know one of his followers years later was corralled by the crowd and killed, assassinated there on the street while Spinoza was there watching. And they knew he was Spinoza, and they were killing him because he was a follower of Spinoza, but they didn't kill Spinoza. They were like showing Spinoza, this is how we're going to treat your followers. That's pretty strange, if you can imagine it. So it was still rough, but if you look in Amsterdam today, there is a Spinoza dedicated to him. So this is a statue dedicated right there on the canal to Spinoza. I think it's one of those pictures you could look at least if you have the right copy of it. You can look from all around, etc. So they think highly of Spinoza today in Amsterdam. Obviously not that highly of him when he was actually alive. So that's kind of interesting, I suppose. So what sort of things do we get? Now this is from his Tractatus Theologica Politicus, or Theology and Politics, right? And that's where he applied this mechanistic science that we're getting from Galileo and Descartes, and Hobbes as well, and he's familiar with Hobbes as well as Descartes. And in fact, if you kind of chart these folks, I like thinking of Spinoza as kind of a mash between Descartes and Hobbes. lot of the things from Descartes are all part of Spinoza, but he's got a lot of the politics that comes from the Leviathan. So it's really quite interesting how he does that, puts the two of them together. But so he's applying this mechanistic science to Scripture, and so he analyzes the Scripture not as if it's a divine word that's then written somehow direct from God, as if God literally is writing the book, but instead he interprets it as human writing with a human audience. As you know, so people niched in a particular time in an environment, right, and writing to their contemporaries, right. So if you analyze, and plus he starts doing other things. So he's interpreting Scripture like you would interpret nature, basically, studying the nature and properties of the language, and he notices, among others, this is maybe the beginnings of this kind of analysis, but he realizes that there seem to be two different traditions, linguistic traditions. Today we would say that there are quite a few, really, and so, for example, the first 5 books of the Bible can be interpreted as having the Yahwist tradition. Then there's also the, and that would all, Yahwist would also be called the Jehovah tradition. Then there's the northern tradition. Then you have the priestly tradition, and then you have the one that's a redactor who kind of combines them and so on. So there's different traditions that emerged in different ways of looking at it. You could look this up if you're curious about these kinds of contemporary points of view. One of them is who wrote the Bible, and that's, I'm thinking, yes, this one. Is this the right one? There's quite a few, actually, as you can imagine. I didn't want to do that. So this one, I used to have a copy of a really interesting translation of Genesis that was published by Harold Bloom, and the translator was, I think, shoot, I forget who the translator was. But it was fascinating. The translation was absolutely fascinating. So if you want, it's the Book of J, and it's edited by Harold Bloom, is that one. But I had a copy of it, and I used to pass it around class. And the one time I took it to class and passed it around, it never came back. So someone decided they were going to borrow it, which, well, that's okay, but they never gave it back. So I ended up losing that copy of the Book of J. And I remember talking to Dr. Beauclair, who was the APU Newman chair at the time, and I told her, rats, I lost my copy of the Book of J. And she said, oh, that one's not so good anyway, get this one. And she recommended I get Who Wrote the Bible by Friedman. And so I did. And it was, of course, a lot more than just a translation of Genesis. It was an analysis of all the different traditions. So that's pretty interesting. But Spinoza starts this, it seems, and you know that leads to certain conclusions that got him in trouble. For example, that Moses could not have been the author of the first 5 books, and yet that was the tradition that the Jewish people believed, that Moses was the author of the Torah. And the problem with that is that Moses says some things that Moses couldn't have said. And if you're reading that with a clear eye, you kind of recognize it. You know, for example, one of the most famous is that Moses was a very humble man, and for Moses himself to have basically said that he was a very humble man wouldn't have been very humble. In fact, it's kind of a Woody Allen joke, that you announce that you're the humblest person in the room, and very proud of it too, by the way. That's kind of hilarious because of the paradox, right? So it seems odd that Moses would have called himself humble. It also says that Moses never made it to the promised land, but that's in the book, which Moses wrote. And so that's kind of odd, considering that he wouldn't have known that he hadn't made it, because he would have still been alive at the time. So that's kind of interesting. Okay. So he's interpreting Scripture, Spinoza, the way you would interpret human writing, as opposed to the way it was treated before. So studying the properties of the language, the topics, comparing the passages, trying to figure out who wrote it, when, and how, and to whom. And some of his conclusions, which are not really agreed upon today, were that the first 12 books were written on a single theme by one author, probably Ezra. Well, that's not accepted today. And the prophetic books are fragments. Well, that's true. In fact, thanks to the caves in Qumran, if you're familiar with those, and all the texts that have been found, and now quite well put back together in a lot of ways, because they've got DNA, so the goat skins that they found on the pieces, and they were all in pieces because the Romans found the cave and destroyed they stomped on everything in the caves. This was after the revolution in 70 AD, when Rome finally had it with the Jews and basically destroyed Jerusalem. The priests and many others fled and hid their precious things in the caves. Of course, the Romans took what they could, but a lot of the stuff they just destroyed in place. Well, that's what, of course, they found and put back together. Thanks to the DNA of the skin, they could actually match the pieces now, and so they've got books that'll tell you these are the books from the caves in Qumran, etc. So we have all these other writings now that include a full text of the Bible at that time. Does not have the New Testament, obviously, because that hadn't been written at that time. But it does have books written by the Essenes, who were a religious group. So today, instead of just thinking there were two groups in Jerusalem, the rabbis, the Pharisees, and the Sadducees, the priests of the temple, now they say that there were three religious sects associated with the Jewish communities there. The Essenes were the third, and those had a community in Qumran, which was where there were baths that were especially associated with cleansing yourself before the temple rituals and things. You could see those are archaeological sites that you could go visit if you're a tourist there, etc. So there's a lot of things that Spinoza got right, but a lot of other things that he was just starting to question, that today contemporaries, of course, have been doing a lot of research, etc. And interpretations of God's revelations are flawed. And the problem here is that they were not scientists. And Spinoza, now that we've got Galileo and we've got Descartes, we've got this new mindset that we apply mathematics to things, convinces him that some things, for example, that Yeshua was fighting and the sun stood still until, they were able to completely finish the enemy, right? And Spinoza, thinking about Galileo and Copernicus, thought it would absolutely be impossible for the sun to stand still while that happened. So that couldn't have happened that way, etc. That's just one example, but you could find others that a scientist would just look at and say, and what are we talking about? Really an Aristotelian empiricist of the time, not suggesting Spinoza is really close to anything, of course, that we have today. So what impact did Spinoza have? Well, during his own day, he was very secret because he didn't want to get in trouble. He did have followers that were a little less secret, obviously, and that got them in trouble. So be careful. Martin Luther had the same problem. Some of his fans or followers took his teachings and went off with glorious anticipation of being welcomed everywhere they went, and instead got a hot welcome and burned at the stake instead, because they weren't. So be careful when you have ideas that not everybody accepts. Remember Thomas Aquinas interpreting Aristotle also had Moses Maimonides' works to use as a resource, his interpretations of Aristotle. And one of the books that Moses ben Maimonides wrote was The Guide to the Perplexed, which advised you not to teach things to people that had no need of it. If it's complex, don't tell people that don't need it, because you're just going to get them mixed up. They're not going to like you, etc. So Revelation for him is practical. In other words, and by the way, I would accept this today too, and say that God, when I define God as that in which nothing greater can be thought, and we'll be discussing that as we get into his ethics. When I define that, I'm thinking in terms of what physicists today would call the cause of the Big Bang. It's very abstract. I wouldn't think in terms of someone sitting on a throne in space. I'd be puzzled, well, what keeps them on the throne? After all, there's no gravity there. Don't they have to breathe? Does God have to go to the bathroom? Just stupid sorts of questions, of course. If God is male, doesn't he have a wife? Because it seems pretty silly to be male if there's no female of the species. That's just pretty dumb. And if he does, obviously, the female is the wiser of the two. So that's just dumb, thinking that there's a male God, who's absolute, because obviously Isis or, some other female would obviously have to be first. It's kind of like what came first, the chicken or the egg, etc. By the way, it's a terrible answer to say the rooster had to come first. That's just really bad. Don't use that joke. Sorry. Okay, so for Spinoza, nature is God. And I don't think he means just nature as in what we think of as Gaia or Mother Nature in that sense. I think he meant the entire universe and all of nature in that sense. Because he's aware, I'm pretty sure, of the idea that comes from Plato in the Timaeus, and that is that the Egyptians argued that God, the creator of the creation, could not be a part of the creation, but had to be external to the whole shebang, or it doesn't make sense, right? So you never think of the physicist as arguing that the Big Bang was caused by a sun that got upset or something, a solar explosion or something. No, because if they're talking about the beginning of everything, it's got to be before that, right? So it can't be part of nature in that sense. Laws come from God in the sense that the order of the universe, so E equals mc squared, is something that is part of the very organization of the universe. The very essence of God is nature being as it is, a lawful self-caused system. So there's no intervention in the normal course of events. So if you're looking at a cliff and you think, gosh, if I pray to God, maybe he'll let me jump off this cliff. The answer, Spinoza would tell you, is no. God gives you sense so that you know not to jump off the cliff. Right? That's how God helps you in that situation, right? No jumping off of cliffs. So truths that God reveals are of direct practical value. That's how to survive. You know, and in a sense, when we think of one of the good, religions have obviously been important to humankind. When we look at the sociological, anthropological sources of religions, they all tend to have developed certain practices for very practical reasons. You might think all the different laws of how you should prepare food to be rather a burden on someone who wants to be, what's the right word, halal, I think, is that, or kosher, right, or whatever. But they're essentially the same sorts of things that your mother teaches you. If you've cut raw chicken on the counter, you've really got to clean that up good, because you could get all sorts of toxins as a result of that bacteria developing on the counter. And then the next person that comes along and makes a sandwich there could end up getting sick, seriously sick, right? So those are, you know, maybe some of them mixing milk with blood. You know, I don't know what sort of health issues there might be with that. But if you think of it, those are things that a culture develops because for some reason they've learned that this is bad. Don't do that, because it could be poisonous or could make you sick. Or if you think, why do the religions in the Middle East not eat pork? Right? You're familiar with that? They don't eat pork. Well, from what I understand, it's very difficult to raise healthy pigs in the Middle East because of the lack of water. And pigs apparently take a lot of hydration in order to raise healthy pigs. That's why Tennessee is great for raising pigs, but the Middle East is not. So if you're eating sick pigs and you've not even got enough wood to cook it properly, you're going to get sick from maybe, trichinosis or something else, right, that the pigs can have. Other things that are banned, having dogs. Dogs are considered unclean. Well, guess what? That's absolutely true. When you've seen, my St. Bernard stick its head on the corner of the table while you're eating your spaghetti, you get slobber on the table because she's a very slobbery animal, right? That's not really very clean, but I don't really worry about it because I'm not going to eat off the table like that, and we clean the table. Right? So things have changed. When Rory Stewart traveled across Afghanistan, Rory Stewart is a really great author. And one of his books is The Places in Between. And it's just absolutely crazy, but he walked across Afghanistan. And are any of you planning on reading the book, or can I give you some spoilers? You are planning on reading it? No. Okay, so I can give spoilers. Okay, so I got in trouble in my book review because a couple of people complained that I used spoilers, and I was like, oops, that's true. Because midway or so across Afghanistan, he befriends this dog that's being beaten up by everybody else. And it has no teeth, and it's been beaten up and everything else. But he befriends it, feeds it, and starts walking, of course, along with him and helps him out. And a couple of times, in fact, in the deep snow at one point, it basically saved him, because of its strength helping him get through, because it got better, of course, while he was feeding it and stuff. And eventually he got to the point where he made it to Kabul, and he wanted to bring the dog home because they were best friends by then. But sure enough, they ended up killing the dog before he was able to get it home. So, very sad. He didn't get to keep the dog. But, I forget, is that what I want to... So dogs, kind of interesting. Another thing that gets me is, what's your favorite symphony orchestra in the Middle East? Anybody have a favorite symphony orchestra? Like Baghdad Symphony? They don't? No. In fact, as far as I understand it, certain imams, maybe not all of them, believe that music is evil because it makes you feel good.
Oh, yeah.
And as a result, of course, there's a lot of music in the Middle East, but it's probably all banned music, especially if you look at some of the bars, which alcohol is also banned, of course. But if you think of some of the different songs, they're really imitations to the max of people like Shakira and Madonna and others, right? Where they're very sexy outfits, etc. Clearly, there's plenty of very sensual music in the Middle East, but strictly speaking, it's banned. And it's very difficult, I think, to get a orchestra together when students are not allowed to have musical instruments. So you can't bring your musical instrument to school, the school can't have a band, etc. That's pretty clear that they're not going to have much music training, etc. And if you think of it, well, I wouldn't want to visit a country that didn't have a great symphony orchestra. That's just me. In fact, one of the things I really like about Anchorage is that we have a great symphony orchestra, which is really amazing if you've ever... just Saturday, for example, I was at the orchestra and they played the Brahms Second Symphony, some new works. They did a Samuel Barber piece, which was great. And granted, they're not the New York Philharmonic or the London Philharmonic, but they're really good for the size of our town. That's great. And if you think, well, as a measure of civilization, an orchestra is really kind of important and difficult because, of course, you have to start when you're young. You have to have a lot of opportunity. You have to have a lot of young people learning musical instruments, or you're not going to get those good ones that then can become professionals, or at least really good amateurs. So bringing this up, because when you look at the different environments in the world, is there an explanation for why there are no orchestras in the Middle East? I mean, apart from the imam saying that it's bad because music is pleasurable. And if you think, it's really kind of a platonic point of view that your soul should be unattached to the physical, and pleasure is physical, and so the more pleasure you have in your life, the more danger you're putting your soul in. And so you should avoid that kind of opportunity to enjoy yourself. Why would the Middle East be an area where that's especially a persuasive belief compared to, say, Las Vegas, which is in a desert? If you've ever been to Las Vegas, I'm still puzzled. They keep building more homes and high-rises and hotels. And when you stop by the park where they had the original well that was the source of water for Las Vegas, it's all dried up now. And so all the water comes from the lake. What is it, Lake Mead, I guess? They're basically stealing everybody else's water in order to keep Las Vegas going. And by the way, when you look at Lake Mead, they're all worried because it's way more empty than it used to be, and it doesn't seem to be growing at all. And so that would tell me that you shouldn't build a new home in Las Vegas, because if you need water for it, it's not going to be there eventually. It's a worry. I don't know. Most people, I guess, don't worry about that sort of thing. But if you put various social organizations into various environments, think of the cities that we have in Antarctica. Anybody know of any really big cities in Antarctica? None. A few scientists in a hovel of a tent, basically, with a few snow caves, right? So obviously we haven't settled in Antarctica. Same thing with the Arctic. I think, what's the furthest north? Sverdlovsk. I don't know what city is the furthest north is of any size. Iceland, I suppose. Maybe Greenland, right? But if you think of it, obviously the environment has a pretty serious impact on the community and what kinds of things the people in that community do. In fact, in the big picture, what we think of it, and by the way, there's a terrific lecture called The Big Picture, and it's a Google talk.
Well,
To move and change. And it implies you don't need to explain why things are moving. Things just naturally move. A way of thinking about physics. That if you see things, the right is the courtroom sketch of what she looks like. Convicted of basically being a mass murderer.
From Harvard, he has worked on the foundations of quantum mechanics, the era of time, and the emergence of complexity. He has appeared on the Colbert Report, PBS's Nova, and Through the Wormhole, and has been interviewed by NPR, Scientific American, Wired, the New York Times, and Google. Please welcome Sean to.
Thank you very much. Let's see. So thanks very much for having me here. It's good to be back at Google. And I appreciate whenever people come out for a talk on this completely crazy title, The Big Picture on the Origins of Life, Meaning the Universe Itself. Usually the response I get when people first see the title is, who do you think you are? How presumptuous must you be to think that you can talk about these things? So I want to get the disclaimer right on the board right away, which is that I do not know what the origin of life is. I do not know what the origin of the universe is, and I do not know the meaning of life. What I do think is that we have a way of talking about these things now that is sort of better than we had before.
So, and that's what makes him a Spinozaist, I believe. By the way, I just discovered him recently, and if you look up his books at the library, the reason you might have trouble checking them out right now is because I just ordered them myself. So, beat you by a day. You know? But wow, this looks cool. So, but I'll quick go through them and then put them back in. So, keep your request in. It should come up. But yeah, this is what's been. Now, obviously, he's got much more technology under his belt, much more history under his belt. But if you think about it, this is what Spinoza was guilty of doing. Was trying to look at the whole picture from the point of view of Galileo, really, if you put it that way. Okay. Now, let's take a look at the actual text. And we could open open the text there, of course, but I suppose we could go that way. Okay, so just looking at the table of contents here, can you see that? Is that too small? How about that? So, table of contents. He's going to follow this pattern that we've seen already with Descartes, that comes from Euclid, that comes from, I guess, a couple others as well. Algebra, the book that gives us algebra, right? Starts off by giving us definitions. You first have to define your terms. And notice that we do that, gosh, in law and politics and everything else. If you want to lay out a kind of a treaty or a new law, you have to define your terms. Glossary might help, whatever, right? But so definitions, we have to give our definitions first. Based on those definitions, we should be able to do our axioms. And then once we have those, we can combine the axioms into propositions. And notice, even though, of course, we're used to doing this in mathematics, it might surprise you to think that we could do this with ethics. Absolutely. Why on earth could we do this with ethics? Well, today, of course, our view of ethics is that it's a much more confusing situation. We're not really very good at defining exactly what our ethical point of view should be, because we have so many different traditions, and we're not sure which tradition is the stronger, how we could get rid of, and they're in contradiction with one another. See, there was something that was interesting just the other day about that. Yes, and that's, for example, artificial intelligence. When we're looking at creating robots or just computers that run things, and we're aware that these newer artificial intelligent machines are going to be able to do things much quicker. They're going to be much smarter than us. And the projection is that within a not very distant point of time, maybe even like 10 years, or who knows, it might even be happening already, some of these computers are going to basically take over in different ways. And we might not be able to have much say in what they end up doing. So the concern that some have, let me see if you're interested in books, super intelligence. For example.
Oh yeah.
Have you seen this one?
I read it.
Oh, yeah. So the question here is, wow, is these computers and things that are going to be running, like your car. You have a self-driving car. You get in the car and you're driving, and the car hits a situation where there's a moral decision that has to be made. Do I, in a situation where I either hit that old lady, or I run into the crowd of teenagers on the bus stop. This is like the old trolley problem, right? What's the car programmed to do in that kind of a situation? What would you do, of course, in that situation? A terrible choice either way, but obviously the one is, if you hit the old lady, well, she's almost a goner already anyway, But the young teenagers at the bus stop, they have their lives ahead of them. Obviously, you should run over the old lady, right? Really, of course, the whole thing would be to stop somehow if you could, but the thing is, given the situation where you don't have that choice, But what would the car be programmed to do? And of course, the worry is that if the car is going to avoid hitting anybody and instead choose to run into a wall, that means it's choosing to kill you and your family instead of somebody else. And you might not appreciate that choice. So when you order the car, are you going to have a questionnaire that you could fill out that says, given this kind of a choice, save me and my family and not, the people in front of the car? Would you have that kind of a choice? And of course, that's going to protect the car manufacturer doesn't want to be sued, depending on what they automatically program in. If you make your choice and you are the one that's guilty of the car deciding to run over the other people, then at least you're the one that can be sued instead of, right? Yeah, I mean, we've got all these problems. Well, the problem in programming these computers to be ethical is that we don't know how to be ethical ourselves. We don't know our own solutions to a lot of these dilemmas. And so we don't have the ethics that we could use in order to program the computer so that they will be ethical in treating us. And so it's a big worry. What's going to happen if they don't like us? They might be like the fictional organization or whatever that wants to get rid of the carbon organisms that are infesting, the Enterprise, and the one Star Trek, etc. So, yeah, this is really an interesting concern. So, we're going to have to figure out a way to make ethics codable for a computer so that we can figure out all the potential. Can you imagine doing that? How would you do that? Figure out all the potential things. I think of, say, your own personal robot going with you to the doctor, and the doctor gets ready to give you a shot. Have you programmed the robot to not zap the doctor when he gets a needle ready, to hit you in the arm? The robot might not realize that's not going to hurt you. Well, it does hurt you. So that's an ouch. You don't want the robot beating the crap out of the doctor, etc. So can we do this? Can we do ethics this way? And what's going to happen? What do we do? So here are some of the definitions. Right? A thing is finite after its kind. By substance, I mean that which is in itself and is conceived through itself. A lot of this is very much based on Aristotle, but in general, it's all from the kinds of things that the medieval monks would have argued with one another. So he's not developing anything new. He's finding the right definitions. What's new is that he's putting them together in this way, right? By attribute, I mean that which the intellect perceives as constituting the essence of substance. By mode, I mean the modifications of substance. And by God, I mean a being absolutely infinite. That is, a substance consisting in infinite attributes, of which each expresses eternal and infinite essentiality. So that's perfectly acceptable to the theologians of the day, right? What is free, that is free, which exists solely by the necessity of its own nature. So that's Hobbes. We go with Hobbes. By eternity, I mean existence itself, etc. Okay. So definitions, he's got those covered. Right? Notice, by the way, in all of these, they don't define the, is, the word, the parts of speech, etc. That's kind of interesting. But so axioms, everything which exists either in itself or in something else. Okay. Not sure about what it means to say it exists in something else, but at least if it exists, it must exist in itself. That which cannot be conceived through anything else must be conceived through itself. Okay? Do these make sense? As you read through these, my feeling is that these make sense, that you're saying, yeah, I agree, Spinoza, you're right, has to be. Right? Might be boring, but from a given definite cause and effect necessarily follows. Okay. On the other hand, by the way, it's interesting that if you have a map of everything that happens, it should look perfectly acceptable to go both directions. Physics, right? The problem, of course, is that if you have something like an egg, and you crack the egg, it's really difficult to glue the dang thing back together and get the yolk and everything back in. You can't really do it, right? So, by the way, that goes back to, I haven't learned his name yet, the guy I just showed you. He talks about the arrow of time, that's entropy, right? Okay. Things which have nothing in common cannot be understood, etc., etc. Okay, so you get the idea. If a thing can be conceived as non-existing, its essence does not involve existence. Everything can be conceived as non-existing. I wasn't here 68 years ago, right? In fact, this place wasn't here 68 years ago, etc. It was here when I started teaching here, so it's been at least here since 95. I don't know when they built this one. So what thing would actually require existence for its essence? He's already tipped his hat to the theologians. God is the only thing that will be in that situation, right? Okay, so now we've got the propositions. Substance is by nature prior to its modifications. In order to change something, you have to have it first. Right? This is all. Notice, now we have a proof for this, right? So you take definition 3 and 5 together, and what you get is this proposition. Proposition 2, two substances whose attributes are different have nothing in common. Proof, also evident from definition 3, etc. Right? So notice how he's setting this up. This is trying to be like algebra, basically, right? So proposition 3, things which have nothing in common cannot be one the cause of the other. I think, for example, boiling water on the stove and love. What? The two of those have nothing in common. Proof, etc. Proposition 4, two or more distinct things are distinguished one from the other, either by the difference of the attributes of the substances or by the difference of their modifications. Well, okay. All of this really seems to work. There cannot exist in the universe two or more substances having the same nature or attribute. Why? Well, they basically be one substance. By the way, this is a wonderful device here, QED. Have you seen that before? QED. It's short for quod erat demonstrandum, which was to be proved. So if you stick that at the end of your proof, basically you're saying, there, right? Right? Not only are you proving it, but then you're like tacking it into the head of the person. QED. And if you could do that with your nose sticking down like this, but you have to be taller than the person, you know, and you're QE, and try to get it in your best Connecticut or Bostonian accent, QED. You know, that's like, is that like, you know, especially at like dinner parties and things, you know, makes you feel sound really intelligent. So one substance cannot be produced by another substance. It is impossible that there should be in the universe two substances with an identical attribute, because they would be the same thing, etc. So existence belongs to the nature of substances, etc. Every substance is necessarily infinite. Ooh, wait a minute. How's that going to be? You've got to follow that. But it works, and now you're pretty hesitant because this doesn't look like it's possible. But then we get to reality or being a thing has, the greater the number of its attributes. Each particular attribute of the one substance must be conceived through itself. Ooh, things are getting dangerous. Okay. Proposition 11. God or substance consisting of infinite attributes of which each expresses eternal and infinite essentiality necessarily exists, and we have a version of the proof here, which is essentially an ontological argument. So God exists, therefore God necessarily exists, QED, as you see. And we've got other proofs, QED, etc. So no attribute of substance can be conceived from which it would follow that substance can be divided. God cannot be divided, etc. So therefore substance absolutely infinite is indivisible. And so here's the one that's really problematic. And it's referred to as Spinozaism, or you could also call it pantheism. Pan meaning all, and theism, God. So pantheism, everything is God. All of nature is God. So besides God, no substance can be granted or conceived. God is all that exists. So this is heresy. As far as Christian theology is concerned, God is other and has created the creation and is not the creation itself, right? So this argues instead for kind of a Buddhist view that everything is God, you might say. He's not a Buddhist, he's not saying that. He's not familiar with Buddhism. The first philosopher, by the way, that will be familiar with Buddhism as far as we know is Schopenhauer in what we look at. But so here's your heresy, and now this is the problem, because people that follow his arguments seem to be stuck. If you're using the definitions of all of these terms as the medieval monks would have used them, it looks like you are stuck with pantheism. So, quiz question, do you find his arguments leading to proposition 14 persuasive? You find his arguments leading to proposition 14 persuasive? In other words, do you find yourself a pantheist thanks to Spinoza's arguments? It's a real issue for me, for example, because if I believe that God is that in which nothing greater can be thought, I'm led merrily down this path thinking that, well, God is so infinitely great that anything else that exists actually would limit the existence of God. So here's God over here, and here's something else. Whoa, that limits God's infinite ability. So it leads me into this kind of a dilemma. Okay. Any questions? Are we having fun? Yes.
Could you repeat the question one more time, please?
Okay. Do you find his arguments in this text? It's the text we have also, but obviously you find it all over the world. Proposition 14, besides God, no substance can be granted or conceived. Does his argument leading to that proposition persuade you? Is it persuasive?
Thank you.
Any other questions? Is that good? You've been finding the philosopher you'd like to do your term paper on?
Do you want us to email you who we're doing our term paper on, or?
That would be good. Email is great.